Hi everyone, it's Miss Saunders here. I'm just about to deliver your lecture on week 2. And I'm going to kind of go over some things that were mentioned during the readings and during the content from this week that I think it might be useful to explain in a little bit greater depth. Just before we go into it, I just want to say that in week 1 we talked about the author of the textbook we looked at in week 1 was talking about how if you get feedback from an editor that is a hard rule, that's not always the best thing to listen to, because sometimes when you're thinking about language used for a specific purpose, it might be appropriate to use things that some editors say you should never do, like a split infinitive. However, this week we see a list of words that the book tells us directly to avoid. So I think the rules and guidelines that they give in this book that we're reading this week, Better Business Writing, I think they are a practical place for people who are new to professional writing or want to become better at writing professionally through a set of guidelines. I think these are solid platforms and places to start. But of course, you always, at the end of the day, want to think about using language towards your specific purpose. So you might find occasions where it's appropriate to use a word that this book listed is actually a word that's best not to use. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that before we go into some of these ideas that were introduced to us in Better Business Writing. Okay, so first we want to think about this idea of relentless clarity. And relentless clarity is important because obviously we always want to make sure that our readers can understand what we're saying, okay? So some things to think about are adopt the reader's perspective, explain your concepts in simple, straightforward English. Of course, this might be different if you are communicating with someone who is in your niche. In that case, it might be more appropriate to use, business jargon in your field. But of course, if you're communicating with someone who's outside of your niche or doesn't have the same level of expertise as you, you want to communicate your ideas in language in which they can understand. It's very important. And a last kind of pillar of relentless clarity is using the idea of show, not tell. And it's actually this idea of show, don't tell is a common tenet that we think about in creative writing, such as writing short stories or essays, but actually this is actually very applicable to business writing as well. And in a second, I'll tell you why. But this idea of show, don't tell is basically allow the details and evidence to speak for itself. Okay, so let's go into this idea of keeping language simple and understanding why it's important. So with every sentence you write, ask yourself, can I say this more briefly? So this book suggests using short words and short sentences, and I think that's a good place for you to start. Again, there's always that possibility where, depending on the purpose of what you're writing and who you're writing towards, you might find that you want to alter this rule a bit. But I think in terms of maximal clarity, short words and short kind of plain words, plain sentences is not a bad place to start. Common problems for young writers or inexperienced writers are run-on sentences and misuse words. So I think kind of simplifying the language in keeping the sentences shorter kind of just avoids two problems that are incredibly, incredibly common. Of course, when choosing your words, you always want to consider your audience. And that's, so again, we talked about using, in businesses in different areas, levels of expertise, there's a certain amount of jargon. And of course, some readers, depending on whom you're communicating with, will understand your use of jargon. But if you're communicating with someone who will not understand, you want to just avoid it completely, because it's really going to interfere with your reader being able to interpret your intended message. Okay, so let's go into this idea of show, don't tell. Just to provide a little bit of background, I have worked I've worked as a writer in a number of different capacities. I worked as a managing editor for a magazine, and I've worked as a technical writer for a consultancy company. So in technical writing, really one important piece of wisdom that I learned there, and I think it's applicable to a lot of different types of business writing, is this idea of show, don't tell. And when they mean show, don't tell, it's supply meaningful, objective details, create evidence-based, clear, and memorable writing. So last week we talked about the quality of silence and subtlety in writing. I think this idea of show, don't tell is a good example of how you can use the value of silence in your writing. And when I talk about the value of silence, I mean let the evidence speak for itself. Instead of drawing out a conclusion, let the objective details imply the conclusion and do that work for you. And it seems like this wouldn't be true, but at the end of the day, this type of writing is ultimately more effective and more persuasive than kind of drawing out the conclusion for your reader. So it's, for some reason, and it seems counterintuitive, let the reader draw their own conclusions instead of writing down the opinion for them. And let me just give you an example, and they gave this in the book as well. So they gave us two examples. So example one, this is kind of an opinion. He was a bad boss. Example two, he got a promotion based on his assistant's detailed reports, but then, despite the company's record profits, denied that assistant even routine cost of living raises. So you see how the example two is concrete, specific, and evidence-based writing. The objective details that they give there imply that the subject in question was a bad boss. But it's more persuasive and ultimately more effective to demonstrate, to show that he was a bad boss instead of just telling us, right? Because if you say he was a bad boss, that sounds like an opinion. Maybe I will be inclined to believe you or not to believe you depending on who I am and who I think you are and how we relate to each other, etc. However, example two, I think that's kind of objective. It cuts across the board. It shows. And so we don't have to, as a writer, you don't have to necessarily say he was a bad boss, because through this value of silence, I can glean that as a reader for myself. And that's really important in terms of creating effective content for professional purposes. Okay, so some tips for summarizing. Because a lot of times in professional communication, you're going to be, communicating with people who are coming in, coming out of projects at different times, and you'll need to have kind of give people a sense of what's happened so far or what's going on, right? So some tips for summarizing: create writing or sentences that can be understood by anyone at any time, and that's a really good solid rule. This idea of using simple language and using, sentences that are clear, concise, and to the point. Of course, last week we talked about this kind of like the idea of this tunnel, writing as a tunnel, so putting things in at one end and the reader reads it and has a different experience from the text that you create. So as you're writing, you always want to be keeping your reader and what their needs are at the forefront of your mind. And one of, definitely a technique of strong writing. So being brief, something that we've talked about before. I think this book, in addition to kind of like, again, stating how important being concise is for all types of professional writing, but particularly now so that we're in the digital age, and, I feel like people's attention spans are diminishing. If you look at the literary world, short novels, short books of essays are very much in vogue. So I think the need to be pithy or to the point is exponentially growing in importance when we think about language across the board, no matter what genre or what its purpose is. So some tips this book gave for being brief. They said, feel free to be ruthless. So this idea I talked about last week about killing your darlings. And by that I mean ruthlessly cut words, even if they sound nice or they ruin pretty sentences, and you really want your ultimate goal is getting straight to the point in normal English. You want to, and when you're ruthless, you want to eliminate wordiness, eliminate padding. This is, again, another really common problem in writing in general, is just words that you're using to kind of, as you're creating content to get to the point. I think if you want to think about creating writing that has less padding, you can do a little bit more pre-writing, so you don't need to generate as much language to get to the point. You kind of have it all already, it's already been gestated in your mind before you start writing. Or, of course, you can just go through this by the editing process, so taking out words as you see that they are unnecessary. So again, with being brief, you just want to think about what language is necessary to get the point across. I think kind of an interesting exercise is to consider the writing in Better Business Writing, the writing style. You'll see this content is very easy to skim through. It's very easy to get the point across. The point is very easily got across, and it's done in simple, straightforward language with usually pretty short sentences. So it's effective language, and it's easy for everyone to understand. All right, so something that's been talked about in a number of different ways is this idea of being plain spoken. So, and I think it kind of builds on the idea, kind of the concept that we learned last week of using the correct emotional tone. So you kind of want to, this is where we think about diction and word choice. Be aware of your voice as a writer and how the reader might perceive you. So again, we talk about not wanting to cross the line between confidence and arrogance. So thinking about the difference between courtesy, using courtesy and expressing restraint. Try to bring your speaking voice into your written voice as appropriate. So kind of using the same voice in your writing that you might use to speak with someone everyday life. And I think this kind of creates a sense of intimacy, which can sparingly be really effective in professional writing. So the list in the book provides words not to use, and I think that's important to consider if you don't want to use them for the purpose of creating a false authority or to demonstrate hyperformality. Of course, in your professional life, you might find some instance occasionally in which these words might be useful, and that's okay too, but I think it's important to think about them as words that are commonly used for egregious or perhaps not good purposes. You also just want to express your ideas as directly and as simply as possible. And it sounds simple, but it's actually sometimes the hardest thing as a writer is to do the most simple things. And that's true, again, not only in professional writing, but across the board. Okay, so they talk about something, it's talking about when organizing content is using chronology when giving a factual account. And they say, only use the relevant facts. And I think it builds upon the idea that we learned about last week, where you want to limit the scope of your assignment before you start writing. So that means kind of you going through and thinking about, okay, which one of these details are necessary? What are unnecessary? And obviously we want to exclude the necessary details. And then a tip that they suggest, and I think this is, again, a very useful starting point, and most of the time it will be what you want to do. Of course, as always, I keep repeating, think about your intended purpose, but it is something that's important to consider as well, especially when we learn about these hard rules. But providing events in a chronological order so they are easy for readers to understand is a really good platform and a great place to start. I think something that we can kind of learn from thinking about how the logic of chronological events, and chronology is things that, like, you talk about day 1 first, day 2 second, day 3 third, just to define that. So thinking about how the logic of chronology builds upon itself, it gives you an idea of how you might want to structure things that are probably outside the realm of chronological events. So maybe just ideas. You want to start with the idea that gives you the exposition for everything that comes after. So, and then you kind of want to see the logic of things build step by step. So if you're writing something that is in a chronological event, you might want to think, What information do I need to deliver first for the reader to understand? What happens next? So kind of mimicking that like piece by piece development of something, I think is useful for thinking about things when they don't happen chronologically. You ultimately, when you're writing and organizing content, you want to see a logical connection between events and topics. You definitely want something when you finish writing it to feel complete, has a beginning, middle, and end, and that all the pieces hang together. And usually you need to understand one thing before you go on to the next. Okay, and another thing that you want to kind of think about as you're creating professional text is you want to show your reader how to read your text. And we've talked about how kind of being in control of a bunch of tiny decisions, right? And I think by making those decisions, you're kind of commanding your reader, understand this first, then this next, then that next thing. So you're kind of having a command of the organization, and you do that by using transitional phrases to guide your reader, use subheadings for easy skimming, and of course, particularly useful in the digital age, break documents into smaller paragraphs and units of meaning. Again, if we think about the language of this book that we're reading, you see they have a lot of subheadings. And what that does is it makes it easy for us as readers, when we are looking for something, it's very easy to find it because it's organized and designed in a way that's maximally clear for us. I think that's the longer the document is, the more important that might be. But I think in terms of avoiding delivering large chunks of text or really long paragraphs is something that's also very useful to consider. And it's also one way that we might think of professional writing as different from academic writing. Academic writing, depending on, there are some modes where you want to think of like an 8-sentence paragraph, or really want to use a paragraph as a space to deliver a point that's necessary in an essay, whereas professional writing, you want to make you're communicating something for a professional purpose, which means making your language maximally clear for a variety of readers, and allowing them to skim and locate the applicable content as they need. So this book gave some really useful transitional phrases that I just wanted to go over very quickly. So if you want to add a point, so you might say and, or, further, also, in fact, moreover, not only, but also. If you want to concede a point, you might say although, and yet, admittedly, at the same time, certainly, even though, doubtless, granted, no doubt, of course, still, though, to be sure, whereas, yet, while. And again, I think using these terms kind of just demonstrates kind of a technical mastery of language and form. And you see you're kind of, as a writer, you're kind of the person in control, delivering different points at different times, but demonstrating the relationship between different content that you deliver. And I think by using these transitional phrases, you demonstrate that mastery, and you make it easy for your reader to understand what's happening because you're showing how different parts are related to each other. So another thing that we talk about, that the author talks about in our reading this week, is how to hold your reader's attention through tone. So one thing is that use personal pronouns skillfully. So they suggest not using an I, but lean on we, our, your. And I think this gives, even though it's a professional document and you want to maintain certain levels of formality and propriety, but I think usually in professional writing, you're writing to someone else. So there's definitely a sense of, and I use this word carefully, I guess intimacy that you want to use, so use of writer's voice and tone. And of course, it needs to be done tactfully and with restraint, but I think the writer's voice is one of the more striking things about language, and usually what's most memorable about a text regardless of its genre. And there are definitely light ways that you can achieve this use of voice and personality. One of them, and I think this is a good example, is don't overuse I, but use we. That can refer to the professional entity, but it's kind of in a more intimate and personable way. Our, your. Something that I've learned as a technical writer, and this is true sometimes, but not all the times, but if you're writing to someone at another business, try to use their name as often as your own. So kind of showing that you are aware of who you're writing to and kind of putting an emphasis on that relationship. Another thing that I've kind of learned throughout my time as a technical writer is I would write for when I was speaking about other people who I worked with and writing their biographies, I was always told to initially use their first and last name. So like, for example, Fred Small. But throughout the rest of the content, I would refer to that person as Fred. So by their first name instead of like Mr. Small or Small. And so by using that kind of first name, I'm creating that sense of intimacy with the reader of who I'm working with and making the reader feel as if they are kind of getting to know the people in my company. So just kind of thinking about language on that, again, very specific, very select level. Okay, and then another thing, of course, we've been saying this again and again, stick to simple language so your readers can follow you. This builds upon the idea of using language accurately. When in week 1, when they talked about Winston Churchill, he used very simple language, but he organized it effectively and according to his purpose, and that's really what made him a great writer, not the offhand use of high diction or certain phrases that made him sound like an authority just because he used a big word. So I think that's an important distinction to make, again, because using words wrong is kind of a common problem in young writing or inexperienced writers. Again, sentence variety in terms of length and structuring of your sentence is another good way to hold your reader's attention through your use of language and tone. So something they talk about in terms of the grammatical and in terms of grammar rules that I wanted to go over in more detail is they advise against using the passive voice. So if you're not using the passive voice, that means you're using the active voice. And I just wanted to spell out a little bit more, go into a little bit more depth about what those two voices are and what is their impact. So the active voice, the subject does the action. So an example of the active voice, and I have the subject bolded and the action in italics. So the dog ate the birthday cake. So in the passive voice, the subject receives the action. So example of passive voice, the birthday cake was eaten by the dog. So we see how the passive voice, instead of ate, is replaced by was eaten. So it's creating an extra word, and it's also kind of, if you have the subject coming at the beginning and you see the direct relationship between who's doing the action and then followed by what's happening, it's more streamlined, right? So when we think about why it's important to use the active voice most of the time, we see the active voice ensures clarity. It shows who is doing what and to whom. The passive voice obfuscates meaning and confuses and uses more words. So active and passive voice, the difference between them really has to do with the direction of the sentence and the relationship between the subject and the verb. And it's usually better to use the active voice because it creates a clear image in the reader's mind. It creates a faster moving narrative by using fewer words. And it's generally, I want to say, more advantageous to use the active voice. Again, this isn't always going to be true. It's just a good base for you to start or something to consider as you're writing. But again, I don't want this to be taken as a hard rule because I actually don't really believe in hard rules. I think you should always adapt your language to your particular situation. All right, everyone. So that's the end of kind of my digressions and tangents about the week 2 content. I hope you found this helpful.